We're in week 9 of the Bible Challenge, which means that you are almost 20% through all of the Bible. Next week we'll hit 20% basically. And we are finishing up chapters 21 through 36 in Numbers, Psalms 47 through 52, and chapters 5 through 10 in Luke's Gospel. So we ended last week in Numbers in chapter 20, and that's when Aaron died, following the sin of Moses and Aaron at Meribah, where they did not trust in the word of the Lord. Now the narrative shifts to the struggle to enter the Holy Land as Israel travels across the plain of Moab. And so in chapter 21 we begin with a fragment relating to a successful invasion of Canaan from the south, but then we get this whole account of fiery serpents, which arrive as a consequence of Israel's ingratitude for the manna. Now, the word used for these serpents refers to burning or fiery. It is the same Hebrew root that we get seraphim from. Seraphim, angels being sort of flame-like creatures. We have the cure being that Moses makes a bronze serpent which he holds up on a staff. Also referred to as a brazen serpent in some translations, or a fiery serpent. The church fathers have always looked upon this as foreshadowing the cross, because in the account in Numbers, when somebody has been afflicted by one of the fiery serpents, if they look upon the serpent that has been lifted up before them, they will be saved. When we look upon Christ, who is lifted up before us, we see our salvation. Jesus makes that point in the Gospel of John when he says, "When I am lifted up, I will call all the world to me." The narrative continues through accounts of travel and battles. We get this self-contained story of Balaam, or Balaam as it's normally pronounced in English. But Balaam is described in two ways here. First, as one who acts only upon consulting God, and then as one who proceeds despite the will of God and has to be instructed by his donkey. The two different depictions may reflect differences between a J and an E account, a Yahwist and an Elohist account. The account of Balaam's donkey, Balaam's ass, or Balaam's ass in the popular parlance, appears to be a story independent from the rest of the story. It's probably a folk tale that's been put in here, that he's riding on his donkey and he's so clueless that the donkey is the one who tells him what's going on. Note, however, that he has been enlisted to curse the Israelites, but because of God's presence, actually pronounces a blessing upon the Israelites. We get another apostasy, just as we had in Exodus. This is the apostasy at Baal Peor. And this is accompanied by a denial of who God is and by sexual promiscuity with Moabite women. This being sort of allied with worship of a foreign god. Those who worship Baal are killed at God's command. And again, we're getting evidence of more than one authorial strand going on here. Now, when we look at this sexual immorality and apostasy, remember what we talked about back in chapters 18 and 19 in Leviticus, where we got that whole sexual purity code. The refrain throughout the sexual purity code as to why you're going to do this or not do that is, "I am the Lord." In other words, you are to be my people in this way because of who I am, because of who God is. That's a story that we see reflected here as well in the apostasy, when sexual immorality is condemned because it's a denial of who God is. It is a worship of a foreign god. The narrative shifts here then to the preparation for the conquest of Canaan and a division of the land. This includes another census of the tribes, and we get some legal rulings on inheritance. Now, since Moses is going to die before the people enter the promised land, because of his sin at Meribah, the narrative shifts to the commissioning of Joshua Moses' right-hand man. Joshua's role is a military leader, not a prophet. Additional preparation includes specification of calendars, rituals, high feasts, as the culmination of the process begun at the time of the writing of Exodus. In Numbers, the description of Sabbath is not as a day of rest, but only made in terms of the sacrifices that will be offered on that day. In other words, your work is different on Sabbath. It's Sabbath work. Vows made by women are now recognized as binding. They weren't before. This is a late development in the evolution of the community. We get a holy war launched against the Midianites in part in retaliation for their role in the apostasy to Baal Peor. Again, it's like remove the temptation, remove the foreigner. The section of the book, therefore, is probably a late addition by the priestly writer. It links Balaam to the Baal Peor incident, and its dependency on other writings may indicate the section found in chapter 31 of Numbers to be what we'd call a midrash, rabbinic commentary. The balance of the narrative here really focuses on the settlement of the tribes of Gad and of Reuben in the Transjordan, and on an overview of the desert itinerary of the people and in a portion of the land of Canaan. So the people cross into Canaan, and we now get details about settlement. In the Psalms this week, we start out in Psalm 47, which is an enthronement psalm celebrating God's kingship. We can compare this to Psalms 93 and 96 through 99. The Lord is to be acclaimed not only by all the people, but also by all the gods of the vassal states whose conquest is described. This probably reflects an evolution in monotheism. As the Psalms are being written, Judaism is becoming more and more strictly monotheistic. It is passing through a very early phase of what we would call henotheism. Now, we're used to the term pantheism, which says God's everywhere, or panentheism, which means God is in everything. Henotheism means, okay, your nation has your God, and my nation has my God. And as long as I'm faithful to my God, what you do with your God doesn't matter. As the faith becomes more complete, we start seeing people saying, these foreign gods aren't gods at all. There's only one God. But we still see the reference to the gods of other nations here in Psalm 47. Psalm 48, like Psalm 46, is a Zion hymn. The motif is of the divine mountain and the defeat of nations hostile to Israel. Psalm 49 is a wisdom psalm with echoes of Job found in the themes of death being the end of wise and fool alike. Psalm 50 probably represents part of a covenant renewal liturgy. We get prominent themes from the prophets calling the people to obey the commandments and to convert their hearts by the doing of God's will. Psalm 51 is one of the penitential psalms, an individual lament, for which the heading links the psalm to David's adultery with Bathsheba. And so this is the one we use in part of the Ash Wednesday liturgy. This is one that we will use in the Good Friday liturgy. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, is the theme of Psalm 51. This is where we are recognizing our sin and offering it up to God, to God's mercy. Psalm 52 is often classified as an individual lament, but it's actually difficult to fit into any standard category. The evil actions described in the psalm have to do mainly with the actions of the tongue, bad speech, cutting people down in what we say, and we can compare this with the 3rd chapter of the letter of James, where he talks about how we can set things on fire with our tongue. In Luke's Gospel, now we're in chapter 5, and the narrative in this section focuses on Jesus' ministry in Galilee. The promises of God having been described as fulfilled in Jesus and for all, back in chapter 4, the story continues first with a positive response to Jesus' kingdom message. And this acceptance is tested in Jesus' boundary-breaking ministry to outcasts, for example, a leper, which results in opposition from the religious authorities. In Jesus' time, like in our own, when we start crossing boundaries that some other people in the religious establishment think are important, this is when people tend to push back. Note, however, that our Lord always breaks boundaries, and we're called to follow him. In response to the opposition Jesus gets from the religious authorities, he asserts his power to forgive sins, and that his mission is to sinners. Those who are healthy have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Jesus exercises authority. His authority's been challenged, so now he's going to exercise it. For example, over the Sabbath, he selects his apostles and teaches, or his disciples at this point, and teaches how the reconstituted Israel is to be gathered. We get the Sermon on the Plain in chapter 6. This is Luke's parallel to Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. Luke is more abbreviated compared to Matthew, and Jesus' teaching is not here an example of teaching about right living, but about right relationship with God. Chapter 7 and 8, beginning of chapter 9, we get a narrative that makes clear that Jesus' kingdom message is for men and women, and that he shatters the boundaries between clean and unclean. The Gentiles are open to Jesus' message in this account. God's gifts of mercy and forgiveness are exemplified in Jesus' compassion for a widow in chapter 7, and how a woman sinner responds to God's gifts. Women disciples are described. Remember, a disciple in a biblical sense at this point is somebody who follows the teacher, literally sits at his feet is the word disciplos. But women are described this way. We notably get Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary's unusual. First of all, she has a surname, Mary of Magdala. She's not described as somebody's wife. She's not described as somebody's daughter. She's not described as being under the protection and authority of a man. That's extremely unusual in Jesus' day in first century Palestine. She's described as talking to Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, in public. Jesus goes into homes where women are present. These are breaking a lot of boundaries. Remember that when the Gospel was written, when all the New Testament was written, there were no chapters and verses. Narrative just flows along. And so here's where we start getting the start of a myth that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. There is no biblical record of Mary Magdalene being a reformed prostitute. She is described as having demons cast out of her. But we see at the end of chapter 7 a notorious sinner who bathes Jesus' feet with her tears. And then in chapter 8 we immediately get Mary Magdalene being prominent, before the time of chapters and verses and these divisions being made. Pope Leo I, in a sermon given in the year 451, basically read the two stories together and made them into one woman. And this is where we start getting the idea of Mary Magdalene being a reformed prostitute. But that is actually a strained reading of the biblical record. For Mary to have a surname means that societal convention is not really in place here about her being under somebody's protection. And we get Magdala is a village of Galilee near Capernaum and Nazareth. Mary is named along with the wife of Herod's steward, and with Susanna. And we get a description of women providing for the needs of the disciples out of their means, chapter 8, verse 3. This is pointing to women of wealth. This is pointing to women of some independent means. Mary, having a surname, means she's probably a businesswoman of some kind. And they're now starting to travel with Jesus and the other disciples and provide for them. In giving new life to a girl and a woman, Jesus is depicted as having authority which exceeds all ritual purity when he raises the daughter of the synagogue ruler. So we're going to encounter Mary again, of course, at the end of the Gospels, when she's the first one who encounters the risen Christ and is commissioned by him to take the news of his rising to the other disciples. This explains why in the Eastern Orthodox churches, Mary is traditionally known as the apostle to the apostles. She takes that word to the other apostles. As Jesus' Galilean ministry draws to a close, Luke is making clear what fate awaits Jesus as he's now turning to Jerusalem. The fate of John the Baptist foreshadows Jesus' fate. So we get the chapter 9 story of what happens to John. Jesus' gift of feeding, the miracle of loaves and fish, is linked by Luke to the cross, very explicitly to the cross at 9:10 through 27. And so we are to interpret God's mercy through the cross. Now at this point, this is not evident to the disciples. And Jesus teaches what it means to follow him, that discipleship has a cost. This, of course, will be a theme prominently developed in the 20th century by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Having taught about the cost of discipleship, Jesus teaches about mission and how this relates to observance of the law. That's all of chapter 10. And we get the famous parable of the Good Samaritan included here. What do we do with this parable? Well, we have to remember that the Samaritans are considered unclean by the Jews. These are people who have been imported by the Greek king, who is an heir to the reign of Alexander the Great. Again, women figure prominently. Women are in full discipleship with men in Luke's gospel, and so particularly since Luke is writing to Gentiles, to Romans, this is pretty radical. Under Roman law, under Greek law, women are property. And so for them to be accorded the status of disciples, Luke is, despite the fact that he's kind of apologetic to the Romans about Christianity, Luke is making clear that the rules have changed, that there's a new king, his name is Jesus, and how we follow him looks different from how we follow Caesar. We'll develop that theme as we move forward. Next week we will begin in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. We'll continue through the Psalms, and we'll continue in Luke.